Welcome. In this video, what we're going to be looking at is how to write about plays and to go through the various devices, techniques, and also through the various methods of writing about plays and how you would go about doing so. So let's just get straight into it. And when writing about a play, what you're actually going to be writing about is the manuscript version. So it's a thing not to forget when you're writing about plays, particularly for an English assignment or for an exam, you'll be mainly writing about it in terms of the actual text and not through the play itself. Now the reason for this is quite obvious, which is that every director who puts a performance on essentially does it in their own way. And so if you were to get a whole heap of students going to different versions of the same play, you would get different readings, different interpretations on it, and it would be much, much too difficult. So this is why we only focus on the manuscript version of it. Now, the main thing you focus on when you're looking at the manuscript version would be the characters and the dialogue, and together how they shape the story and the value of the play. Now, the dialogue forms the heart of the storytelling in the play, and it's basically because the entire story, in most cases, is told through the dialogue. It's through characters talking to each other, interacting with the audience, and with basically through each other, we start to see a story evolve. And by discussing their language and discussing the language of dialogue is the most important thing you can do, particularly when you're discussing how the play is put together. But then when you start to interpret the themes and start to really go through the ideas and the techniques which are used, that's when you really start sort of focusing quite heavily on what dialogue actually does. Okay, so what will you be writing about? Well, the main thing you'll be probably writing about in terms of plays will be the themes of them. Now, themes in plays are represented much the same way as they are in other types of text, and particularly in things like prose and poetry. Now, the reason why I say that it's very similar to how it's depicted in, say, prose or poetry is because if you're looking at it from a film aspect, film uses visuals as well as dialogue. Now, even though plays generally use dialogue, they don't use it in the same sort of sense that film does, and film can be quite minimalistic when it comes to dialogue. In other words, the dialogue doesn't have nearly the same level of importance as it does in a play. And so when you're breaking it down, you're really looking at it as if you were looking at a poem, breaking down the ideas as they are represented through that, or also through a prose piece as well. So when you're looking at themes and how they're represented, you'll be mainly looking at the dialogue, as I said, and you'll be interpreting the dialogue as you're interpreting any bit of prose or poetry text. And even then, there are some things which do overlap with film as well, but that would be the majority of techniques, and particularly poetry, given the way that it's often organised, arranged, and especially if you're looking at something like Shakespeare, for instance, you'll see quite a huge link between poetry and Shakespeare. Though both characters and dialogue, a play attempts to evoke the same emotional connection with an audience as other texts do. And this is basically what any text is trying to do, is they're trying to connect with the audience. So through the characters and dialogue, you're basically able to start to draw an attachment between the audience, the ones who sit in the theatre, and even the people who read the manuscript version of it, and also through the characters of the play. And basically through their characterization, through the way that they act and the way that they behave, we start to draw a connection with them. And it also shows that there are a number of there's a depth of ideas to that too. There's a depth of meaning to it. And particularly with a lot of characters that you'll see, and especially the most popular and classic plays, have very, very deep tapestries and very, very deep backgrounds behind them. Some of which really don't come across perhaps through a performance of it, or even just through a very simple reading of it. But there are characters, particularly in plays, which have a very, very strong sort of sense of morality, sort of even things like sort of a confusion, a sense of twisted purposes. You've got a number of different characters who have a number of different roles. And so by interpreting those characters and really going into them, going deeply into them, you're able to get really to the heart of what the play is trying to do and what it's trying to represent. So basically a play is evoking the same sorts of things as you would get for another kind of text, but it does this purely through characters, and it's for this reason that they are mostly, well, they're character driven. Now, compared to a lot of other texts which can have a variety, most texts are generally character driven, but a play especially so. and that very few events will drive a play. They will be driven entirely by the motivations of the characters, by what they do, who they interact with, and basically what is said. It is essentially, plays are a look at the human condition, so to speak. They are looking at how people behave amongst each other and how they react to different things. And so this is why they're basically purely character driven, whereas an event driven sort of story, one which is primarily driven by the events and things that happen around those characters, is very hard to do in a play, particularly because of the lack of space that you have, and often because of the lack of budget that you have when you're producing a play. And essentially a film can make use of that space, a prose text can make use of that space. Unfortunately, a play can't. But what it does instead is it tells a story which can be told on stage, something which is, as I said, driven by characters, the things that they can do, and essentially the life stories, the morals, the opinions, the ways of thinking that characters have. And certainly through plays we start to get that. So you'll definitely see plays being driven by the characteristics of people. And when you're writing about them, and this is the most important thing, is when you're writing about them in terms of what each character is essentially doing. Now, I'll go through this a little bit later when we start to look at analysing sort of characters and meaning. But what you're really doing is you're looking at how characters and how the interaction between characters is really constructing meaning. So, for instance, the title character in Hamlet is on a quest for revenge. It drives the story, and so it drives the theme. So, going back to this idea of theme again, basically, what we're doing and what we're seeing through the way that these characters interact with each other is essentially what their main ambition is, what their main desires are, is what drives theme. And so, the character of Hamlet in Hamlet, his quest for revenge, is essentially a theme, and revenge becomes a theme of the story because of the fact that it becomes really a part of Hamlet's character. So when you consider links between characters and ideas, what you're really saying is how characters represent a particular theme. In this case of Hamlet, it's revenge. So when you're writing about it, you'll be saying that Hamlet essentially represents the main theme of the text, which is revenge. Okay, so let's look at how techniques are basically constructed for a play. Now, techniques are quite important because they are essentially what an author, or what a playwright, should I say, uses to help construct a play essentially around the motives and the things that they want to communicate in it. Now, essentially, technique is used as a storytelling device as much as the characters are. And certainly when you look at characters and the way that they're represented, you see that certain characters, as I mentioned, embody certain themes. And the same as certain techniques embody a method of communication that's essentially reflecting what the play is trying to do and what the play is trying to make the audience feel. So when you're discussing the theme of a play, you're discussing characters, but when you're discussing the techniques of a play, you're discussing how the play is constructed. So there are two very important distinctions there. One about the construction of the play, how it's put together. Of course, you'll see various things when you look at dialogue, particularly in depth, and certainly we'll go through that in a second as well. And then you also look at in terms of the characters and how they represent main ideas. And picking the techniques which are used by a play is pretty much the same as doing it from a novel, as I mentioned there, which is essentially what you're doing is you're going through some key scenes, key sections of the play, and you're essentially analysing them for what sorts of techniques, what sorts of devices the play uses, and certainly, if you can, providing some technical terms that goes with it as well. Alright, playwrights will often vary their language, and particularly this variation of language is essentially, it often comes with the character's diction, or basically the way that they talk. And so they will vary their language, but they'll also vary the way that the play is structured, and this dramatic structure is really quite important, because this is what gains a reaction from the audience. Bear in mind that characters speak in different voices, and this is essentially what I mean before by diction, which is that characters will speak in various kinds of ways because they are different people. And certainly if I was to speak, if someone else was to speak, we would have two different styles because we're two different people. And the same as with plays, in that most plays will have characters who are quite distinct from each other. Maybe you won't get that so much in a play such as Shakespeare, for instance, where the characters, while they still do have their own sort of morals and motifs and those sorts of things, and essentially their own style, most of the characters speak in the same sort of poetic and strongly worded style that basically a lot of Shakespearean plays are written in. Whereas if you look at other characters in plays, and particularly more modern plays, you'll start to see something more akin to film and these sorts of things, where characters speak in very clear and very distinct voices. And they come across as real-life portraits of people rather than so much caricatures which really burst to life on stage. The techniques used in the dialogue won't be the same for all, and certainly characters, as I said, because they speak in different ways and they'll use different styles, there will be distinctions between each character. This also suggests that basically we're missing the part of the actor here. Now, we won't be writing about it because, as I said, we're not looking at the performance nature of the play, and certainly we're not looking at the play on stage. And often characters will portray particularly famous characters in many different ways. So if you see 3 or 4 actors play Hamlet, for instance, they're all going to be different. And this is different because of a number of reasons. First of all, the actor, but second of all, because of the direction of the play as well, in that the director will also choose a different style. But even in the playwright's vision for a particular character, we still see elements of those characters which are different from each other and do set themselves apart. And certainly we see this through the, as I said, through the motives of each character and through the sorts of things that each character desires, and certainly in the pursuit of those desires in a play, the pursuit of what it is that they're trying to achieve, their motivations, their ambitions, we start to see those different voices come out. Okay, so let's look at how meaning is constructed in plays and what value meaning has. Now, obviously, whenever you discuss a play, you're going to be discussing the meaning within it, you're going to be discussing how it's constructed, you're going to be discussing basically the combination of theme and technique, which we just went through. And so, and this is a thing, and we'll go through it again, which is that themes often have to do with the characters and the way that they interact, their motives, their ambitions, and the way that these conflict with each other, which is certainly where you see this come into it, and particularly themes are quite strongly represented through that. But also techniques, even though they relate to how the play is structured and the way that it's all put together, techniques still represent how these characters interact with each other. And so you start to see when you put these things together that plays are about relationships and particularly conflict. Now, one may argue, yes, this is about all storytelling, that all storytelling is based on some sort of conflict, it's based on some sort of hardship and adversity, and certainly this is one thing that comedies and tragedies have in common, is that there's this story about overcoming hardships and adversity, or overcoming conflicts. And essentially, this is where conflict comes into it. Now, when it comes to plays, and what you're going to be focusing on more so, is the fact that plays are almost entirely about the characters overcoming conflict with each other. And so, or even overcoming adversity and hardship with each other. And so when you're looking at it, you're going to be really looking at how these characters are represented, how they are portrayed, and how they are essentially imagined by the playwright. And this will lead, of course, if you do go ahead and watch a play, to how they are performed and how these actors do fill in these shoes of these characters. So let's just go through a quick checklist of sorts of things that you can discuss and you can talk about and certainly raise in terms of how plays construct meaning and how they do represent this idea of conflict, which is really important. The first one is their ambitions. Now, I did mention this before quite a bit, which is the ambitions of each character is really significant, and which it will come through the language which is used by each character, but also through the various things that each character will express when they're speaking. They'll express what sorts of things they want in life. And through these different voices, through each character and what they want, we start to sort of see where these two things are in conflict. So when you look at their ambitions and when you interpret their ambitions, what their desires are and how they are represented in the play, you start to see where conflict is built. Next thing to look at would be their personal qualities. And essentially, this is their personality. And essentially, if you've got some very hard-headed people coming up against each other, that is going to create conflict as well. And their relationships are going to be rocky, whereas if you've got two people who are meant to be together, again, you'll still see some similar qualities between them. So if you look at the nature of these characters and essentially how their personalities are represented and how they are shown through language, then you'll start to see, again, some links which you can discuss and you can relate back to meaning. The relationships between characters, and this is, again, I guess, linked in with personal qualities. In which case, you look at essentially the link between the personal qualities of characters and their relationships with others. Essentially, it's the difference between a character being an aloof, a loner, those sorts of characters, compared to very sociable, cocky, arrogant sorts of characters. There are different qualities which set them apart. So, for instance, your aloof character is often one who's very withdrawn, doesn't speak to people, has often limits their dialogue. They show a persona or a character who is quite unable to connect with others. And the same as if you're looking at someone who's very sociable, then you may see a more bubbly aspect to them, something which is more congenial, which means they can basically interact more with others, they can feel comfortable around others, all those sorts of things. So if you look at those two things together, you'll start to see some relationships building. And how you interpret these things is basically looking at dialogue and essentially the lines that each character uses to represent these sorts of feelings, these sorts of attitudes. Interpret what sorts of symbols and motifs are in there, if necessary, if you can find any. And certainly through a lot of modern plays, you'll see this through the representation of their, essentially what they say will indicate what these qualities and relationships are. And certainly you look for lines that do this in a very poetic sort of way, and if there is some sort of poetry which does represent it. Now, most plays you will study will have some sort of poetic relation or way of basically describing these things. They don't just come out and say, I love you. They'll do it in a more rounded sort of way, or they'll do it in a sort of more roundabout sort of way where you have to interpret it. You look at their setbacks, and particularly how they cope with adversity, and certainly you see this, and this is where the distinction between a tragedy and a comedy does really occur. Now, because you've got these very broad categories for a play, a tragedy and a comedy, their setbacks are usually represented in far different ways. Obviously, in a tragedy, this is usually fueling a desire for revenge. It's basically fuels what is the tragedy, whereas in a comedy, it is considered a little bit differently. It's considered a hurdle, a positive thing that must be overcome in order to find happiness. And so the way setbacks are represented are often quite indicative of the type of play. And the way of speaking, the way that each character speaks, is looking at how characters, as I said before, and this again relates to all these other things, do relate to each other, and how they are basically, how their diction sort of represents who they are and what they do. Okay, so now we've got all those ideas out of the way, and we've got how plays construct meaning, we've got through the idea of how they create themes, how they create techniques, how do we write about them? As I mentioned before, most of your information about a character will basically come through what their dialogue is saying, and through you interpreting it, from you quoting them, through you doing all those things. So with all of those sort of ideas running through your head about what each character is doing, how they're trying to represent different themes and main ideas, how the playwright has used these techniques to represent these things, how all of these things together create meaning, you've then got to sort of work out what lines do represent that the best. However, this, as I said, does overlap into what creates meaning, especially as they can reveal more, or the play basically can show off what they're pursuing. So even if you're just saying, well, this line here represents their quest for revenge, it could also be a driving force for the play as well. So this is basically what we mean here. So when we're saying that things do overlap, certain lines can represent more than one thing. And when you're interpreting a line, be open-minded to the sorts of things that may be represented by that. And that it may, as I said, drive the story. It may reveal more about their ambitions, their pursuits, as I mentioned, or they may simply reflect a bit about that character. You can represent a number of things with the same line. And dialogue is quite interpretive that way. And that because it's something that someone says, you can either attach it to what that person says or you can attach it to the meaning of the play, one or the other. And because all of the techniques that you'll be discussing, or virtually all of them, barring some elements to do with stage and stage directions, are all going to be managing basically how these characters reveal themselves and how they portray themselves to the audience. And we certainly do see various elements of power and as I said, relationships sort of reveal themselves and unveil themselves throughout the play through other sort of nuances, but dialogue is the predominant thing that you'll be focusing on. And so when you're looking at how it constructs meaning, it's going to be constructing various types of meaning. It's not going to be just focusing on one bit. And this, as I said, reinforces the importance of going through dialogue and characterization effectively. Is by looking at how these characters work, then you're starting to really develop how your response is going to sound. And now, the one trap not to fall into here, and this is something to be very careful about, is essentially going, well, this character wants this character wants that, this character wants that, the end. You need to discuss it in terms of how this all overall contributes to the play and what each character's role is. Your focus should be probably more on the meaning of the play first, and then how each character fits into it. So rather than focusing on the characters straight up and then trying to link it to meaning, focus on the meaning and then use your characters as evidence to support it. Essentially, what each character does to represent what you've decided is the main ideas, the main techniques that are being used. So, when responding to play, you must basically discuss who and how and who, should I say, ideas are represented by each character, how this is conveyed, that is through techniques, and how character conveys this. So essentially, who is representing these sorts of ideas? So in the case of Hamlet, for instance, Hamlet is representing revenge, as he is a character chiefly after revenge. There are other characters after revenge as well, but Hamlet is the main one. How this is conveyed, so through what devices, what sorts of techniques do we see this? And we certainly see it a lot through soliloquies, as is with Shakespeare's work. And how does their character convey this? So not just through the techniques which are used, but how is it conveyed through dialogue as well? Now finally, we've got all these things. We've now starting to put a response together because you've got all of these things. You're focusing on, first of all, identifying a theme, what it is you're discussing, depending on what the question is asking you to do as well. But if you're preparing just in general, you would focus on what some main ideas are and how each character represents these various ideas. Once you have all these things and you've started to work out these sorts of things, then you're working on basically sharpening these to the point where you can basically put these into an argument. So you should always focus on sharpening these where possible. Try and focus on a couple of key scenes in depth. So essentially, once you've got these sorts of ideas from just a general reading, start to find some specifics. And this is what I mean by sharpening, is try and find some specific elements of the play which will sum up what it is you're trying to say and use those as your direct quotes. Climactic and notable scenes from play will allow you to extract the right kind of detail. And certainly that's what you want to be doing, is you want to be breaking the play down into bits, and as we've done so far, we've broken it down to themes, we've broken it down to techniques, we've broken it down into various methods of constructing meaning, we've broken it down into how all those things work together. And now we're working it into how to put the right detail in. Your focus is essentially making use of detail wisely, or essentially using the right sorts of evidence to support what it is that the question is asking you to discuss. Not every question will ask you to discuss a theme or a character. Some may ask you to discuss various techniques, in which case you will focus on the techniques and how they are used and how they are used by each character. Depending on the question you get, you have to adapt your details that you use, and so it requires not only to have an understanding of all those concepts I mentioned before, but also have a sort of a basic rough idea in your head about what each thing does. And finally, stating who says what, as I mentioned before, is not as effective as discussing characterization, technique, and meaning as well as dialogue. So putting all those pieces together, as I said, is much better than just saying this character did this character did this character did this, as I mentioned before. And the simplest way to cure that, as I mentioned, is to simply say this, is that I've got a main idea, and now I'm using the elements of the play, the characters and so on, to support that main idea. Support whatever that main technique is, whatever the question is asking me. I've got a variety of materials here which involve things like theme, techniques and so on to be able to discuss it and be able to construct it. And that's essentially all you need to know about writing about plays. And I hope this serves you well, and that you start to look for these sorts of techniques. Remember that you should be picking out scenes rather than the whole big lot, because particularly in the case of a lot of plays which are really lengthy, you're going to have a bit of a hard time trying to break down the whole play into smaller fragments if you've got plays which are a couple of 100 pages in some cases. So you need to be very selective, and you need to be thinking rather carefully about it. But otherwise, I wish you luck. Until next time, I'll see you later.